Yes, alright, we are recording. Hopefully it'll... I think what had happened is I thought I had registered the program, but apparently I hadn't, and now I've registered it, so it shouldn't stop at 15 minutes. It should proceed unabated. Alright, we're keeping it candid.
There's sort of a lot of ambient noise on your end.
Alright, let me see what I can do about that.
It sounds like you're in a restaurant or something.
I'm in a coffee shop. What I will do is I will...
Okay, lost sound.
There,
lost
okay.
sound.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Alright, what I'm going to do is I'll probably end up muting myself intermittently. I'm in a coffee shop to cut back on the ambient background noise. So...
Okay. I mean, it's up to you. If you're happy with it, that's fine.
Alright. Well, Eric, thank you for your patience in this titanic struggle.
Sure.
We started this conversation, was that Thursday or Friday? I think it was Friday.
I can't remember.
And the point of departure was you started to talk about how technology is inflecting the manner in which we experience the world, transforming it in a way that is perhaps, while acknowledged, not entirely appreciated, from which we then transitioned to a few glosses around phenomenology and how within phenomenology there's a tension between whether consciousness should be characterized as a fundamentally static or dynamic phenomenon, because they're both of those facets contribute to what's unfolding. We made some glosses around Husserl, then we transitioned to Heidegger, and you noted Heidegger's concept of ecstasis, right? And from there, we thought we might pivot into existentialism, but unfortunately, the recording pooped out. So that, I think, is basically where we were. But to dial it back just a little bit, because I visited, before calling you, your video on technology and academia on your YouTube channel, and maybe we could bring it back to technology and your thoughts about technology, as that, I think, is an issue of great moment, and your thoughts around information as opposed to knowledge.
Well, one of the main themes in that video is that as a product of technological evolution, if that's the right word, the higher order structures of consciousness are beginning to change and shift in a certain way. And the way that I characterized it in the video is that I feel that consciousness over time is becoming much less structured around literary narratives and literary sorts of structures. And by literary structure, what I mean is construing our experience in terms of stories that have beginnings, middles, and endings. So moving, I think, more away from that and moving toward what I'm calling iconographic consciousness. And iconographic consciousness, instead of being structured in a narrative way, is structured around fragmentary sound bites and images and fleeting, more or less disconnected sensation. And that's beginning to supplant, I think, the role of meaning in our conscious lives, which to me is a higher order function of consciousness, not so much like perhaps distinguishing red from blue, but construing our lives in terms of significance and meaning in a certain way. And I think that this has implications for how we deal with knowledge and truth and various epistemological constructs, because truth and knowledge, of course, are going to be meted out less in terms of narratives or narrative-like structures and more in terms of sort of singular, fragmentary moments and sort of lines of fracture and that sort of thing. And I think that this is part of what some of the structuralist and postmodernist type thinkers are onto when they say that, well, what we used to construe of as meaning is nothing more than, is becoming nothing more than a kind of logocentrism, and really what's beginning to take over is sort of the Baudrillardian hyper-real, and it's sort of the rise of simulation and fragmentary images is beginning to hold greater sway than the stories and historical narratives that used to hold our lives together for us. So that's part of what I see with respect to technology and where it begins to intersect with phenomenology. And of course, then the question becomes, well, if that's really true, then to what extent are previous phenomenological insights still going to be regarded as valid? Because if they're issuing from a very different sort of historical, cultural context with a very different predominant mode of consciousness, then are they still relevant today if the higher order meanings of our consciousness have shifted? And for instance, sort of Jean-Paul Sartre's vision of freedom, is that still going to be much as he described it, in terms of the dynamics of bad faith and that sort of thing, in the 21st century as it was in the 1940s when he wrote Being and Nothingness? Or are these phenomenological thinkers going to need to be revisited to see which portions of their insights are still relevant in a technologically dominated age as opposed to a sort of later industrial? I think of the 1940s as a later industrial age, although they had radio and I guess the very beginnings of the computer age were from then.
Right. I mean, I believe, as a historical footnote, a lot of times when you talk about information theory, people cite Claude Shannon's paper, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, which I want to say came out in 1948, maybe 49, and which he does that at Bell Labs, and that the intellectual construct he found there, when it's joined to some of the work done by Alan Turing with respect to algorithms. So I think that's apt to say that really before the 50s you have adumbrations of what becomes the information age, but it's still essentially
adumbrations only, but they weren't in the thick of it the way we are. And the more important point, I think, is not merely with respect to the world that we inhabit today, but you see, we're following the arc of a trajectory that only seems to be increasing in the foreseeable future. So the question is, for those of us who really have a kind of investment in phenomenology and existentialism and the insights that derive from them, to what extent can we still hold forth about the validity of those insights?
Well, I am personally relatively sanguine about that potential, but that may be in virtue of my willingness to countenance something like what might be charged as a certain essentialism, which of course will run counter to some of the more extreme articulations of a postmodern account. But I'm very keen on the distinction you're drawing between an iconographic and a narrative approach to reality. I think the former, that is the iconographic approach, despite what value it has, also suffers from the fact that temporally speaking, it's very singular. But our experience is necessarily temporal. So we may frame it in a fragmented manner, but it seems that there's something inexorable. There's just no way out of the temporal quality of our encounter with the world. And I would argue by extension, it's necessarily historical and narrative character. There's an evasion, perhaps, of the historical and the narrative character of our consciousness, because that character itself may carry implications. which would be counter to the imperatives of the systems in which we find ourselves ensconced. So, an obvious example is capitalism, insofar as capitalism has a relationship with time which is fundamentally antagonistic. It seeks to sort of invoke the old Marxian trope, I'm paraphrasing, but it really does want to annihilate time and space, because time and space stand in the way of unbounded growth. And I think that antagonism is intimately related with this process of fragmentation that I think you've correctly identified. But what do you think about that?
Well, I think the jury's still out on the question of to what extent are these changes, how deep do they run into the terrain of our awareness? Are they merely sort of plays upon the surface, or do they run to the mid-level or to the very deepest level? Because I think another thing that's going on with respect to technology is, at least at the surface level, it's altering our sense of temporality, our sense of how time flows. And the question you're bringing up is, I think, that, well, to what extent is this sort of a expression, a relatively superficial expression of where we are with respect to our world state and the dynamics that are running through it, and to what extent is this really reaching to the fundamentals of what it is to be a being, sort of caught in the vortex of time? To what extent are these alterations in our sense of time and meaning reaching down into the terra firma of what used to be our meaningful, narratively structured lives? And I think that, for me, the jury's still out on that. Like, it's hard to say how deep the changes are going to run and to what extent they're going to overturn or subvert some of the earlier phenomenological insights.
Oh, there you are.
How's it going?
Good.
It looks like you have a troubled look, like your
I got
computer's giving you
Got it.
trouble.
I'm back now. All right. Well, it's not superficial. I think that I don't mean to suggest that it is. I think that they're related. I think that the phenomenon of fragmentation is going to severely impair our ability to relate with ourselves as human beings, because it is leaving out that temporal dimension of our existence, and it's not capable of actually destroying that temporal character, because that, I feel, is fundamental to our actual being, but it's occluding our awareness of it, and so it's not intrinsically taking us out of step with our personhood, but it's serving to distract us from what can happen when we...
Okay, your signal's getting garbled, Tom. So your last sentence was garbled and I couldn't hear it.
Let me try that again.
Okay.
I don't believe that current happenings can intrinsically destroy the human condition, but it can radically, or it can, I shouldn't say radically, but it can severely impair our ability to relate with what it is to be a human being by diminishing the significance of the temporal, historical, or narrative quality of our experience as subjects.
But the post-structuralist, usually I don't take this side in an argument of this type, but their argument would be something like, well, this whole talk of the human condition and what is fundamental to the human condition is really nothing more than a particular set of discursive habits and exercises, and that really what's going on is we're beginning to let go of what we've historically understood the human to be altogether, and more is the power on that score, because our historical conception of what we are fundamentally as human beings is really and this is sort of a typical argument, kind of a construct in the service of various power agendas and keeping people sort of in line and regulated and in a certain relation to power. And so their point of view, unlike yours, and I think unlike mine actually, because I'm not really a post-structuralist, although I can trot out some of their arguments, that really, when it comes down to it, I think that there's something to the project of phenomenology and existential phenomenology that to me is always going to be convincing, no matter how intellectually adroit and clever the kind of post-structuralist arguments are with respect to the undermining of our humanity or the fundamental nature of experience as a construct or anything like that. So in a way, I'm on your side of the equation.
Yeah, go on.
But at the same time, I recognize that there are these arguments out there that almost anything that you would bring up with respect to a kind of point of stability, whether it be experience from a phenomenological point of view or our human condition from a more socio-cultural point of view, is going to be nothing more than another play of signification in relation to power, is usually how they cast it. So they're not nearly as sanguine about all of this as you know.
Well, and there's a lot of power and force in their suggestions, and oftentimes I think that they're not appreciated. But I guess, like you say, you will find these existential phenomenology always sort of convincing. I think that, and I as well, because as much as our reality is inhabited by construction, you cannot absolutize that degree.
Yes.
There's a fundament upon which the construction is predicated. And in that fundament itself, I'm going to put forth, and here you may just come to a point of impasse where the resolution is beyond the capacity of discursive language to convey. That fundament itself has a certain essential structure to it, and part of that structure is time itself, is temporality, and it's the time which compels us to frame our universe in narrative or historical terms in order to enter into a meaningful relationship with that universe. Now, I mean, I guess the counterpoint can then just be reintroduced. Well, why do you have to understand the universe in a historical or narrative way, right? Because you can say that time itself is just a dimension of mathematical character, like it's just the z-axis, or that would be the xyz. I don't know, z prime.
Well, a fourth dimension, let's say.
The fourth dimension.
Yeah.
But there's just there's a disjunction between the discursive portrayal of the world and how the world is, which by analogy with, map projection, let's say, okay, you're trying to put 3 dimensions onto 2 dimensions, you can never actually do that quite correctly. And I think maybe what's going on with the post-structuralist position, and I'm speaking very loosely here, is that by trying to absolutize the degree to which our framing of reality is constructed, they're trying to force a tool which is powerful but not infinite, language or concept, to encompass something which simply cannot fit within its boundaries. That our experience, or reality itself, is necessarily going to exceed.
Well, a lot of this to me boils down to a classical debate, point in philosophical history between Hegel and Kierkegaard. It's just being recapitulated in our modern age, and sort of Kierkegaard's response to Hegel's dialectical conception of history was like interesting, maybe at some level true, but the fact of the matter is you've got to decide whether you're going to get out of bed in the morning. And it's that sort of bedrock, that fundamental stratum of experiencing the world, which is the thing that everything else is going to revolve around. including whether you find sort of constructionist arguments or post-structuralist arguments convincing or not. Whether you do or you do not, you're still going to be stuck with the task of finding a reason to get out of bed in the morning. Or whether you see things in a Hegelian sort of dialectical way, you're still going to be stuck with that same very personal task. Like, what sort of thing is going to compel you to get out of bed and engage the world? And you, Tom, tend to cast it. I'm hearing you cast it more in terms of sort of temporality and the flow of, temporality. For me, I prefer the language of experience more, but I could see, obviously those two are related because our experience, of course, is wedded to also the experience of time and construal of what's going on in terms of past, present, and future, or whether you think of it in a Heideggerian ecstatical way or whatever, it doesn't really matter. But to me, that sort of debate in the early 19th century is kind of being recapitulated in the early 21st century when we live, where now in post-structuralist terms, yes, you can decide you're going to view reality in these highly constructivist ways, and you can conjecture whether those reach down to the sort of innermost sanctum of what we think of as our humanity and our subjectivity and our experience and so on. But at the end of the day, when you're done theorizing and conjecturing, you're going to be stuck with the perennial human task, which is, how do you get out of bed in the morning? How do you engage the world around you in light of your very fallible attempts to perceive what's really going on and so on? And so for me, like that's why I'm not a post-structuralist or a postmodernist or a Derridian deconstructionist or anything like that, because that central human question to me is so damn compelling. Like, how are you gonna engage the world, given that you're thrown into it? If you like that Heideggerian type way of talking about it. Also, Jim Morrison, right, said the same thing in one of his songs. Into this world we're thrown, right? So how are you what are you gonna do about that? Are you gonna sit around and decide you're not gonna do anything because everything is ultimately constructed for you, and that sort of seething ocean of ongoing constructive dynamics is something that you cannot hope to sort of resist or have influence on as a singular human being? I suppose that would be one option. But to me, it's not the most interesting or fruitful option for philosophy or for human existence generally. The more interesting and fruitful option is to sort of see things as deeply as possible in light of our unavoidable human task, which is to engage whatever the moment is offering up to us in hopefully the deepest, most perceptive, most powerful, fruitful way possible, knowing full well that that's fraught with all kinds of ambiguities and all kinds of imprecision and all kinds of dimensions of fundamental impossibility and all kinds of constructivist type dynamics running through it. But that doesn't negate the more fundamental question, like, what are you going to do with your life? To put it in the words of Twisted Sister, to move from Jim Morrison to Twisted Sister. So, it's probably these old school bands you can't relate to because I'm a little bit older. But, to me, that is the fundamentally unavoidable task, even if you're of deeply post-structuralist persuasion. Like, you got to decide what's going to get you out of bed. So for me, like Kierkegaard sort of hit the nail on the head, oddly, for us in the early 21st century, although he was writing in the early 19th century, and sort of the ocean of historical dialectic can be much like the ocean of ongoing construction and fragmentation in which we find ourselves. But once again, there's that inescapable task that each of one of us has.
I think there's the very broad overlap between our positions. And it's almost kind of paradoxical that I was focusing on the temporal as opposed to the experiential. And that was chiefly because of the issue of fragmentation and how that sort of negates the significance of history and potentially throws people into a condition of despair, maybe exemplified by something like Blade Runner, right, where like the future is now. You see, there's no idea, or you there's a sense of futility which I think pervades our culture. And I think that futility is connected to this alternative, I keep using the word fragmentary, fractious, segmented manner in which everything is presented. And I think in part that connects to the question of information and why we focus so much on information as opposed to wisdom, in a way that actually includes that or conceals the manner in which information itself reflects an interpretive or set of interpretive decisions, a hermeneutic problem, if you like, right? Which draws back to the question of meaning. But it is like, what are you going to do, like getting out of bed in the morning, right? You know, what? That's you know, life lived forward, not backward, and so on and so forth. I mean, what do you think some of the concrete implications are for our relationship with technology? This doesn't follow strictly organically from what we've been saying, but, you know.
Well, I think one of the well, you got me a little distracted because I wanted to say something about what you said earlier.
Feel free to respond as you see fit.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'll just go with your last question. Well, I think one of the implications is that, first of all, I don't believe that what technology is calling us to do is any kind of retrograde motion as a species or as a society. In other words, to sort of harken back to the halcyon days of yore when everything was nice and pristine and we lived before the Turing test and all of that kind of stuff. Like, that to me is a non-workable, that's a non-solution in my view. I think that what our technological reality is calling us to do is find new ways of inventing and reconstruing what these earlier thinkers, the phenomenologists and existentialists, were onto in new and novel ways in light of, to me, the fact that our consciousness is shifting and our relations with each other, I think, are shifting. For instance, you know, you can talk to a guy in Ohio instantaneously, more or less, than a guy that you barely even know, and have a kind of conversation and so on. Well, guess what? 50 years ago, that wasn't going to happen, you know. And our sense of temporality, I think, to an extent, is being changed by this. I think that this is one reason why ADD and ADHD, hyperactivity deficit disorder, and things like that have sort of come to the forefront of our awareness in the world. It's because our attention and you know, the nature of our consciousness and our way of inhabiting temporality are being altered somewhat by all this. And I think that what it's really calling us for is to become creative. I think the creative impulse is really what technology is asking of us. And by creative, I mean sort of coming up with a you know, unprecedented, spontaneous response to our world that is hopefully the bearer of more beauty than ugliness, would be my hope for it, more constructive than destructive, and to begin to sort of ride that arc as deeply as possible with respect to our relation to knowledge and the academic enterprise. I think that part of what that would entail is beginning to move less toward the sort of chimera of always generating more and more new knowledge and having that be sort of our saving grace for the human race, and beginning to shift our movement more in the direction of wisdom. You brought that up earlier, and I wanted to respond to that. So to me, wisdom, which oddly enough is one of the etymological meanings of the word philosophy, to be in love, a kind of love relation with wisdom, to me is one of the creative invitations that our technological world is issuing to us. And by wisdom, what I mean is our capacity to be very sensitively attuned to what life is actually doing and asking of us from moment to moment. And second part of wisdom is our capacity to respond in a way that's harmonious to what we're detecting and hearing. To me, our world is asking us much more for that capacity and much less for more information and more knowledge. So to me, one of the sort of creative challenges is to shift our attention away from generating knowledge and more toward generating wisdom. See, it doesn't really work for me, from my point of view, for us to generate knowledge that we don't really have the sagacity to handle anyhow. Like, that to me is not sort of a positive outcome. Like, we can know enough to destroy ourselves, but unless we possess the wisdom to work well with that, it's not going to be a winning proposition for the human race. So one of my recurrent themes in my videos and lectures and all of that kind of stuff has to do with beginning to shift the locus away from information, for sure, maybe even away from knowledge to an extent, and more toward wisdom, which is a much more evocative project, right? It's much more about evoking a certain sensibility than it is about, having more propositionally correct assertions in your mental Rolodex of propositionally correct assertions, So like the human race already knows enough, I think. Like, what we're really missing is the capacity to live well with what we already know. That, to me, is the creative challenge, to begin to live well with what we already know, which to me is a way of just glossing wisdom, the term wisdom. One of the dimensions of it is how we live in relation to what we know.
Nice.
So, and this may seem a little utopian possibly at this point, but so what? I think that, like, we're too used to setting our sights too damn low in the world, personally. Like, we're so used to just trying to get to the next damn weekend or the next damn vacation. And what we're not used to is beginning to let our world context sort of raise our field of vision up high enough so we begin to aspire to things that are actually commensurate with the souls and the being that we actually are and the potential that runs through that. But that's just me, and I could be wrong.
No, but I don't think you're wrong. But as you're talking, lots of things were sort of, it lists lots of, I know that, like, for example, you touched on Buddhism and meditation in some of your videos. I think I hear with the emphasis on the need to be aware and responding to the moment, some of that influence, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah, that's...
And there are certain other things, but the other thing that occurred to me as you're talking, in terms of whether or not technology is inviting us to enter into a relationship with wisdom, is the criticism of someone like Jacques Ellul. I don't know if are you familiar with Jacques Ellul?
No.
He wrote this book, The Technological Society, and he was kind of in vogue in the 60s. But his critique of the Technological Society is that it subjects everything to an instrumental rationality. So everything is just a means to something else. And it creates the impression that we can control reality. And the consequence is the objectification of everything, and eventually that cannibalizes and we objectify ourselves in the process, right? Which is out of step with wisdom, where part of wisdom is letting go of the need to control and being open. And then, to me, paradox is always actually a strong indication that you're in the vicinity of truth rather than error. As you open, all of a sudden, and surrender, to use a maybe sort of too religiously evocative verb there, oftentimes new options come to the fore. And maybe that sounds a little too rainbows and unicorns, but I think that really does have a role to play in how we're responding to the world as it's unfolding at present.
Well, I think so too. I think as this conversation is going on, I'm sort of appreciating the extent to which our thinking is pretty actually sympathetic, although you sort of a little bit different sort of spin on it than I do. Obviously, you picked up on the fact that I'm pretty much an inveterate meditator and into meditative states of consciousness, and the whole project not merely of describing consciousness, but of actually sort of deepening it and widening its perimeter and so on by way of meditative practice. And Buddhist thought and that sort of thing, but the language of sort of surrendering, to what is as a way of engaging what is more profoundly is a project that I'm very sympathetic with, and to me that would be another way of glossing this wisdom business that I've been talking about a little bit. That to me would be another creative sort of invitation or challenge that the technological world is bringing up. I think that the central question of technology is, at some level, the extent to which we're using technology for our own betterment as opposed to technology using us. Because technology uses human beings too. There's a kind of inherent logic and agenda, in a way, to the ongoing burgeoning proliferation of technology in our lives. It has a certain inertia and a certain trajectory, and we put a lot of human genius and energy and effort into furthering that trajectory. And sort of the surface rationale for all of that is, well, we want better tools so we can do more with our lives and bring more benefit to ourselves and to the world more generally, to all sentient beings, if you like that Buddhist way of talking about it. But the danger is, of course, that technology will begin to sort of use us to the extent that we'll become enslaved to it. We'll be too sort of zombified by our cell phones and boxes and, keeping track of virus software and all of this, that, and the other, and sort of lose that deep sense that the existentialists and the Buddhists too were trying to conjure, which I think is the deep sense for being.
Yeah.
It's really what they're about.
And a recognition of the adequacy of the moment, because there's this drive to constantly be distracted or stimulated, or and there's the idea that it's actually sufficient to just be where you are.
That's the language of revolution, almost, in our world.
Yes, it is.
It's a sort of radical thought, But I think, like Martin Heidegger has a sort of interesting treatment of technology, and his treatment is that, well, it has both a power and a, what's his phrase, saving grace, Well,
that's toward the end of his famous essay, right? The question of technology.
And there's another one called, I think it's called In Framing, or no, The Turn. That's it. And in it he discusses in framing. But anyhow,
I haven't read that, but the Discura or something like that. But I have read
Kara in German.
Yeah.
So that's a turn. That's the turning. But anyhow, he sort of localizes this double-sided sort of eros and thanatos sort of structure to technology, and the thanatos part is that, well, technology always, as you say, Tom, distracts us and sort of entertains us. Like it'll entertain us to death if we let it. We'll be entertained to death, and that's by death. What he means most of all is losing our contact with being as such, and losing our sense for the question, and losing our lived sense for what it is to be, right? Now, the saving grace of technology is that it's possible for us to use it as the way of sort of safeguarding, is the word he uses in translation, the question of being, sort of keeping ourselves safe. But I think technology always has this double-sided question it poses to us. Like, is it a way of enhancing our existence, or on the other hand, is it more about a kind of enslavement? And probably most of the time, it's an amalgam of the two, right? It's sort of hybridized. Like, in some ways it enslaves us, and in other ways it liberates us. But the danger, the Heideggerian danger, is that, well, if it liberates us so that we don't have as many back-breaking chores to do, that's only important insofar as it can prompt a deeper liberation, which is the liberation with regard to being, right? So can technology be put in the service of being? Similar kind of question, I think, in Buddhist thinking too. It's like, well, if technology can sort of make your life such that you have more time to, let's say, meditate, or more time to develop compassion for all sentient beings, then it's a real boon. But if it's going to be a force that pulls you away from that, then it's going to be a bane for the most part.
Yeah,
and I say all this with some fervor because I don't know if you sort of gleaned this from my videos, but I worked in technology, so I was one of the people who was building all of this world for years, and I did 2 degrees in it and all of this. So I have a very sort of personal stake in these sorts of questions. I should probably admit that right out front.
well, it's just, being engaged at that level sort of will heighten, hopefully, your awareness of the hazards which accompany it.
Yes.
And actually, just to add something on that point, I'm a little bit, more than a little bit, I'm actually distressed as to how unvarnished the optimism about technology tends to be from people working in that domain. In my personal experience, obviously you're an exception, and there are other exceptions, but within that sphere, I'm a little bit sort of taken aback at how, and I guess maybe it's not altogether unsurprising, but how there's this real sort of almost blindness to how problematic the fetishization of technology has become. And I think it finds sort of is epitomized by things like transhumanism and within the sphere of biotechnology and the idea that we should be seeking indefinite or effectively immortal life, which sounds like just crazy, but there are people who really are moving quite earnestly in that direction. And maybe you could respond, or how do you relate to that?
Well, first of all, my first response is that actually I was just about to say what you just said. That in my experience is of people, the cognoscenti of the technological world, is that very infrequently do they have a real discerning, discriminating perception of technologies, not only its benefits, which tend to be the obvious part of it, but also its detriments too, because, the Eagles said that every form of refuge has its price, the band the Eagles, right? I heard from one of their songs. I'm in rock bands, okay? So that's where all this is coming from, so every form of refuge has its price. Well, if you think of technology as a form of refuge, in a sense, from sort of the grindingness of physical labor first, and then the grindingness of having to keep books and do intellectual labor second. If it's a refuge from all of that, well, it's easy to see the benefits, but the price, if every form of refuge, including technology, has its price, it's much harder for the real aficionados of it to see the price. But so I agree with that. But I would say even beyond what you said, that it's not just the people at the upper echelons who are building this stuff. It's becoming more and more pervasively a kind of principle running across the entire social terrain. It's not just that the techno nerds are really enthusiastic about all this, like practically everyone is enthusiastic about all this. I never thought in my life I would witness people shelling out $800 for a telephone. That to me is just like bizarre in terms of my chronology. I'm 56, so I've been around a while, but even my students commonly will pay that sort of amount, and to me that's a marker of the kind of the fetish. You said something about the fetish, technology becoming fetishized in a way, and sort of treating as a sort of almost quasi-sexual libidinal Texas type thing, you know, and I think it is like more and more, but it's not just the people at the upper echelons. It's sort of like running across a lot of the social terrain. So, and I think wisdom, to orbit back a little bit onto wisdom would have also to do with a much more discerning type of experience with regard to technology, which I think is a rarity. I agree with you about that too. So almost everything you said, I agree with in that regard. But so the question is, well, what is it to be able to discern the benefits, but not just the benefits, but also the deficiencies of technology, and to discern it in a way where you're not just perceiving it, but actually actively choosing to engage and disengage in a case-by-case basis with respect to technology. And it's the disengagement part that is the challenge. It's not the engagement, because our social habits are to engage every damn thing that comes down the road. You know, so that's not the challenge. The challenge in striking a fruitful balance is to learn to disengage in a perceptive way. Like, what technologies are really going to, and you can make it personal. I make it personal. Like, what technologies am I going to let into my life? Because especially if you're a phenomenologist and you become acutely aware of things as they enter into your subjectivity and the effects that they begin to have and so on. Like, technology is a kind of thing that enters into our subjectivity and has effects. So what are you going to fill, you and I, going to fill our subjectivities with? And I don't think it's every damn thing that comes down the road. To me, that is not a fruitful answer, in part because then we're too easily manipulable.
There's no distance of reflection.
Yes.
And when you lose that distance, you lose the capacity for choice.
You're right, and so your freedom is compromised. Now here I probably should admit to you, I don't speak a lot about her in the videos, but I'm sort of a Simone de Beauvoir in terms of my sort of meta-ethics. I'm sort of like on.
I don't know very much about her. I've been meaning to.
Well, she wrote this book called The Ethics of Ambiguity in the 1940s, right soon after Being a Nothingness came out. So, and her thing was to take sort of the threads of an ethical theory that were running through Being a Nothingness and really sort of flesh it out and make it more obvious and sort of, you know, cast it in terms of principles rather than sort of vague impulses, which in Being a Nothingness, it's really not developed, you know, but it's there, but it's not developed. So she went and developed it. And anyhow, what she comes down with, you can almost, if you know about sort of Sartre, you can almost sort of anticipate what she would come up with. And it's what she calls the practice of freedom, which means like any ethical good or any ethical system that holds forth an ethical good is really subtended by a kind of meta-ethics. And the meta-ethics that she outlines is the meta-ethical good is always what deepens and broadens freedom the most for all concerned, you know? So, like, and I was pretty moved by that book. And so, like, for me, you know, the question of freedom, which you coded in terms of choice a couple minutes ago, it's like, well, you lose your choice, and I agree. Like, you lose your sense of being an agent, like a free agent who's like capable of bettering not only our own lives, but you see, her idea of freedom is very subjective too, right? So not only our own lives, but the quality of everyone else's life too. And that to me is a tremendous stake in all of this. That is not a trivial issue from my point of view. That is a really, like, I mean, like, how much would your and my life be worth if we didn't have some stake in that, some participation in that? And my answer is not very much, is the way I see it. It would be worth precious little. I think being a well-oiled gear in a efficiently functioning machine is way overrated from my point of view. You know, not that it doesn't have its time and place. It does. Like, efficiency is part of our world, and achieving pragmatic ends is part of our world, but it's not the point of our lives, right? To be efficient, pragmatic robots, basically, you know, and sort of the deeper echelons that to me are the precious thing that's really at stake in everything we've sort of been discussing, Tom, is that sort of almost primordial sense of being sort of a free agent, like being a participant, not a spectator, not a programmed robot in the universe, but an active agent in the unfolding of universal transcendence from moment to moment. That the stakes are that great, like our participation in the universe becoming conscious of itself, to me, is worth defending, worth finding greater insight into, worth theorizing about, and so on, and worth developing a much more discerning relation to technology. Although it's painful to do that, believe me, like, like if you start rejecting certain technologies because you feel or you perceive that they're going to occupy your subjectivity in a way that's not actually beneficial to you, you're going to look like a crazy person. I know, because I do this on a regular basis. Like, people are going to find you to an extent incomprehensible.
No,
and
it's
quixotic. They're going to find you quixotic.
That's right. So we need a little bit more. We need some more. We need more quixoticism in the world. Right?
Yes, I think so. I think he was underrated. I think Don Quixote was really a kind of hero, actually. Like, he's usually treated as a sort of fool, or sort of a naive kind of person or something like that. But I think there's a sort of thread of heroism that runs through him.
Well, fun.
But
He's not conceding to cynicism. Right.
Exactly.
Cynicism
yes.
is the enemy, and cynicism is invoked to justify capitulation before all these imperatives. Be cynical and so forth. I just, like some social media, for example, to me, it's even incomprehensible how people actually enjoy it. Like Snapchat or Twitter, where, you have this infamous compression of communication, and it's
Yes.
it's just I honestly, it's an enigma to me how people are fascinated by that.
Well,
But
okay, so you're another anomaly, evidently. I'm an anomaly that way too. And here's a great example of what I've been talking about. So I'm glad you brought it up. Is that, when you don't engage the Twitterverse and the Facebook verse and like all these sort of modalities that everyone thinks you have to have in order to be coded as something like a valid human being, all of a sudden you become incomprehensible. Well, why aren't you on Facebook? Like, I get this all the time on my YouTube channel. Like, I want to follow you. People say, I want to follow you on whatever it is. I don't even know enough about it. But like, to me, I don't want to fill my subjectivity up with that kind of stuff. That's sort of the reason, is that I perceive that there's a kind of sort of toxicity to it, that even though everyone else is doing it, I'm not going to do it. And
I mean, I'm on Facebook, right? By way of disclosure.
I can't hear your voice right now. Can't hear your voice.
I mean, I'm on Facebook by way of disclosure. Though I don't think I'm quite manic about it, but even so, I can see how it can consume you if you don't exhibit real discipline with yourself in terms of only using it in an instrumental way. But anyway, I just felt obligated to make that point. So.
Yeah, well, I think it's a great point, because it illustrates a couple things at the same time. First of all, it illustrates the idea that our social interpresence is being sort of shaped and influenced by these technological dynamics. But it also, I think the better point that it illustrates is sort of the kind of tension that exists between people who want to sort of reclaim sort of their fundamental freedom and that sort of fundamental latency of being and existence, as opposed to, on the other side of the tension, like the ongoing production of distraction, and entertainment. To me, it's almost comical. I don't know whether to laugh or to cry at the fact that we make billionaires out of people who are adept at distracting us in the right way. I mean, there's something funny about it, but there's something sort of tragic about it too, in my view. So I'm not sure. Maybe I should laugh and cry at the same time. I don't know. Maybe that's wisdom. That would be wisdom for the 21st century, to learn how to laugh and cry simultaneously.
You have to laugh, if not to, so that your tears do not consume you to a point of paralysis. So,
Yeah.
well, I think we're coming up on an hour.
Okay.
So, but I'm just trying to think if there are any other like really major points we should bring up in conclusion. Apart from, well, here's one, right? You know, and it does. I think it relates to the problem of technology in a sort of second order way and how we conceive ourselves as human beings. What I find troubling is the extent to which popular language privileges the discourse of neuroscience. Like, oh, the neuroscience is the neuroscientist is the new high priest of our culture, and the idea is that through an adequate understanding of the biochemistry of the brain, we can arrive at solutions to the human condition, usually pharmacological solutions. But even if they're not pharmacological, there's the idea that we can engineer or hack our own mind. This is the language which pervades the discourse, and which I find highly troubling, because it gives away our agency to really just molecular mechanics. And I feel that's disjunctive, both with how the world seems and how reality actually is. But I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, to me, once again, I think we're sort of kindred spirits in a bunch of ways. So, yes, fetishizing neurology and sort of the dream of neurology, I think, is another way. It's really just another manifestation of the larger technological dream. It's just a way of treating ourselves as technological artifacts, or at least wondering about how we might become technological artifacts. And yeah, I think that, as with any form of reductionism, any reductionistic way of thinking about our lives and turning that reductionism into a kind of fetish, there is like a real danger to doing that. And the danger is not just some kind of abstract dangerousness that's somewhere out in the ether out there. It comes home in really personal, experiential and intersubjective ways in the stuff and substance of our lives. And I think that the real cost, every form of refuge has its price, and the refuge of neurology is no exception, that it has its price. The price is, kind of losing the sense of luminousness and poetry and sort of brilliance and terror also, and majesty and, elation, but no less or more so than tragedy and pain and depression, like losing that sort of wide gamut of human experience and human reality that comes to live and breathe in the concrete moments of our individual lives. That, to me, is too great a cost to pay for any reductionistic dream. I don't care if it's neurologically based, or based upon the principles of operant conditioning, or based upon the idea that we are inextricably members of a social matrix, or a reduction to the unconscious. I don't care what the reductionism is, because for me personally, any form of fetishized reductionism is going to entail too high a cost. The price will be too high, and the refuge in the final analysis won't be worth it, in my view. But that's my view, and I realize there are other points of view, and if you're doing blogs and stuff, you probably encounter people who will argue the other side of it. And I know there is another side. Okay, I'm trying to give you all the qualifications, right? Disclaimers at the end of the interview.
Right. Well, I mean, there is obviously another side. The other side, in fact, is well, maybe things are changing, but I think the dominant or the hegemonic side, because that's the side which is forwarded by people like Richard Dawkins or who sort of stand in for this notion of the secular intellectual, Sam Harris and all the new atheists, as they sometimes call themselves. This is sort of like the default position if you're, in the culture. But anyway, that's a whole other ball of wax, which can be taken up at another time. So, but I think we should maybe wrap it up for today. Though I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. It was fun.
Is there anything else you wanted to add on the way out?
Let's see. Okay, so parting thought. I guess maybe. Okay, here's the parting thought. We've talked a lot about things like technology and wisdom and experience and phenomenology and freedom and free agency. And I think that the question that maybe subtends all of that stuff is the question, what makes our lives worthwhile? I mean, it's a simple, sort of straightforward question. And I sort of pose that in a phenomenological vein in terms of not that there's necessarily an objective answer to it, but in terms of how we experience things. What seems really deep? What seems really powerful? What seems really luminous? What does give us a reason to get out of bed in the morning? And not just any old reason, like, well, I'm going to get out of bed in the morning so that my serotonin pathways function more efficiently. I don't give a crap about that, right? Like, I mean, something at the experiential level, like what is there worthwhile about human existence? It boils down to that, and finding a way of thinking that is commensurate with the depth and power of that question. How's that for a sign off?
Sounds good to me, Eric. We'll leave it there.
Okay.
And
all right.
Thank you.
It was good chatting with you.
Likewise. I'll send you. It should be up, and hopefully by tonight I'll have this up. So, but I'll send
if you can send me a link or whatever, that would be cool.
Will do. And I was engaged by your remark about Simone de Beauvoir. I'm going to try and track down a copy of her Ethics of Ambiguity. I've got The Second Sex sitting in my queue.
Right. That's her more famous work, right? But it's not long. It's like 150 pages, and it's pretty darn readable. Like it's not like some of these really turgid texts that you have to read sometimes. It's like pretty accessible. I mean, it's not like Reader's Digest or anything. So I would recommend it pretty highly.
So
she gives a breakdown of sort of different categories of bad faith and the different ways it plays out, and I don't know. I found it very interesting.
She's apt. So, well, have a lovely afternoon, sir.
You too. Have a great afternoon. Nice chatting with you.
Likewise. Talk to you soon.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.